Welcome back to the show, Peter.
Great to be with you, Marie, as always. Thanks so much for having me.
You're like Christopher Walken's character in the iconic More Cowbell skit on Saturday Night Live when he says, I put my pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody, except I make gold records. You write books and they become instant bestsellers. Now, Blood Money did it not. It was a bestseller on Amazon before it was released, and it debuted at number 2, I believe, on the New York Times bestselling list and became number 1 the following week. Is that correct?
Yeah, we debuted at number 1, then dropped to number 2 the following week, and then went back to number 1. But yes, no, thank you. It's I've got a great research team. We really try to dig deep and not just tell people what's going on, but show them what's going on to explain how our government is failing them. And this book is really about how America's on fire. China's holding an empty can of gasoline, and our political elites are largely sitting there silently while China's policies and actions are literally killing Americans in a multitude of ways. So in a way, it's probably my most, I think, shocking and troubling book of all those that I've written.
Well, congratulations on its success. In many ways, China is the anti-Israel, at least in the eyes of the American media and the rest of the left. While Israel is protesting on our college campuses for defending itself against Hamas, very few tears are being shed over the persecution of the Uyghurs at the hands of China. We hear Prime Minister Netanyahu attacked by the same top figures in the Democrat Party who gush over President Xi, relatively speaking. Why do you believe we are much more sycophantic towards our worst enemy than supportive of our closest ally?
It's a great question, Marie, and I think there's probably a couple of motivations. One is purely financial. Look, the major mainstream media outlets all have commercial interests in China, and if they are going to report too aggressively on what China's doing, the human rights situation, the situation involving fentanyl and China's direct involvement in every stage of its distribution in the United States, or some of the other things they've done, if they report on that accurately, it's going to hurt their parent companies. So let's remember, ABC News is owned by Disney. Disney has extensive commercial relationships in China. Look at Comcast, which controls NBC News. These are corporations that do major business in China. They want to do more, and the Chinese government can take away those profits literally overnight. So I think that's the first part of it. I think the second part of it is ideological. And my view is that the issue with Israel is not just that it is a Jewish state. It is Israel is really the outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East. I mean, it is a liberal democracy. It provides free rights in the eyes of the law for women. It provides an open and free press. And it supports many of those traditional Judeo-Christian values that have fueled the West. China doesn't support any of those. They use them to the extent that they can benefit their position vis-a-vis the United States. So part of it's ideological, and you've got a lot of people on college campuses who, if you are pro-Western, they immediately hate you, i.e. Israel, even if they don't understand the history of what's gone on in the region. On the other hand, if you hate the West and are antithetical to the West, i.e. China, they don't have a problem with you. They may actually cheer the policies you're carrying out.
Who had that on their bingo card for this year? I mean, the rise of anti-Semitism again, right?
Yeah. Now, no, it's a great question. Great question.
Now, perhaps the clearest example of United States sympathy towards China was the American left's reluctance to investigate the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. You highlight numerous examples of this in Blood Money, including writing in late 2020, the United States State Department, under Secretary Mike Pompeo, launched an investigation into the origins of the virus. After Joe Biden was inaugurated as president, he quietly shut it down. When his termination of the investigation became public, President Biden covered himself by asking for an intelligence review by United States intelligence agencies. The results were inconclusive, as most people had expected they would be. Why the lack of curiosity about the origins of such a deadly disease by the left?
I think there's a couple motivations again. Some of them are commercial or financial. If you look at the Biden family, as I've documented, as now the House Oversight Committee literally has the receipts for, the Bidens have collected some $31 million from Chinese entities. So this is a complication. This is an entanglement. And there are lots of members of Congress and there are lots of powerful corporations that give to elected officials in Congress who have ties to China that are very important and valuable to them. And they don't want to rock the boat because, look, if you say clearly as a government that China has carried out actions that are deliberately killing Americans, that has to change the U.S.-China relationship completely. And that's a heavy lift. And so a lot of them don't want that heavy lift because of these commercial ties. I think the second part of it is there is this ideology that has kind of permeated both Republicans and Democrats in Washington that the solution to China is to bring them closer to the United States. They will become more dependent upon us. We'll become more dependent upon them, and that will make them more mellow. Well, that's been the policy for more than 30 years. It's failed. China's not become more mellow. As they become stronger, they become more aggressive. And there are a lot of people that have staked their careers on this false premise. They populate the State Department. They populate think tanks. They're not about to come out and say openly, we were flat out wrong. So I think there's also some professional pride that is leading them to not want to go down certain intellectual alleys because of the results that they're going to find.
One would think that any actor who had accidentally released a virus that would go on to kill over 7 million people would at least feel a bit guilty and minimize the damage. Yet we read in Blood Money that, quote, whether the virus emerged from a lab leak, which seems very likely, or was simply a natural occurrence, as some people continue to insist, Beijing manipulated the world. It conducted policies and actions that maximize the damage the virus would inflict. That in and of itself constitutes a bioweapon attack, end quote. Could you give us an example of how China sought and perhaps continues to seek to use COVID to its advantage?
Oh, absolutely. A very clear-cut example. They knew, everybody accepts this now, China knew in November of 2019 that they had a virus and that they had a virus that was transmittable from human to human, which is important because there was a lot of early assumption and early belief because China was telling them otherwise, that it was not transferable from person to person, that this is just some sort of disease that may have come from the natural world and was now inflicting humans. So they knew that in November of 2019. They did not until the end of January in 2020, almost 3 months later, finally publicly say, hey, guess what? This disease is transferable from person to person. Now, what did they do during this 3-month gap, Marie? They basically cornered the market on PPE supplies. I'm not talking about the ridiculous cloth masks that they told us all to wear. I'm talking about the K95 masks that medical personnel were wearing to protect them when they were treating people that had COVID. I'm talking about gloves and gowns, the things that our medical professionals needed to treat this illness. China cornered the market on that. So when they finally told the world what they were facing, i.e. a pandemic that could spread from person to person, there were no supplies to be found because they had bought it all up and they'd stopped shipping it to the West. That magnified the death count dramatically in the United States. It was intentional upon their part. We lost at least 3,500 medical professionals because they did not have these adequate supplies. The other thing that has to be said, Marie, is that they gave horrible medical advice to us that they knew was not good advice, yes, that ended up exacerbating the problem. So, for example, they told us in January and February of 2020, if somebody has severe COVID, put them on a respirator. And you remember Andrew Cuomo had this rant where he was screaming, I can't get respirators. Why won't anybody give me respirators? Well, guess what? It turned out we realized pretty quickly that no, if you put a COVID victim on a respirator, it actually accelerates their death. It does not help them. The death rate of people on respirators was 97%. This was an action we took because the Chinese government told us this is something that's good and that will work when they knew, in fact, that it wouldn't.
Mm. Now, you wrote, quote, all evidence points to fentanyl being intentionally deployed. Fentanyl is being covertly and systematically aimed at the citizens of our country by a major foreign power, the most lethal peacetime attack in human history, end quote. Yet, why would China engage in this type of warfare when only roughly 74,000 Americans die from fentanyl deaths a year? A huge number, but still only 0.02% of the United States population, Peter.
Yeah, this is part of what they call disintegration warfare, which is they want to do things to damage the United States, but they don't want to raise it to the threshold to where it would provoke the United States into some kind of kinetic or military response. And this is a strategy that was spelled out in a 2012 book that President Xi is familiar with. The military officers that wrote it, he has embraced. What you need to understand about fentanyl, it is now the leading cause of death of people in the United States under the age of 45. And contrary to the view that a lot of people have, that the people dying of fentanyl are those people in San Francisco city parks that are kind of shaking and highly addicted to fentanyl, that's not who's dying. Overwhelmingly, the people who are dying are people that don't even know they're taking fentanyl. It's a college student who's taking a Adderall because they're studying for a final exam. Now, should they be taking an Adderall that a friend gave them? No, they shouldn't. But it ends up actually killing them because it's laced with fentanyl. And China likes this because it is wreaking havoc in the United States. It's cutting its way through our young population. And let's be clear, while the Mexican drug cartels are involved in this activity, they are the junior partners. China produces the precursors. There are 2,000 Chinese nationals in Mexico working for the drug cartels that actually create the fentanyl. The drug cartels use pill presses and pill molds that they've bought from China to actually produce these pills laced with fentanyl. And by the way, according to our Department of Homeland Security, the Chinese sell these pill presses to the cartels at cost, meaning they're not engaging in price gouging. And then the money laundering for the drug cartels. They used to launder their money in Latin American banks. They now launder their money in Chinese state-owned banks. So China is the senior partner. The drug cartels are the junior partner. And this is a very effective way to kill off young people in the United States. And we have a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who want to say that this is a drug problem akin to heroin and cocaine. It's not. It's a very different problem, and it is a designed chemical attack on the United States by China.
Speaking of that disintegration campaign, you warn that, quote, the Chinese campaign to sow violent division in the interest of precipitating an American decline remains very much alive and active, end quote. On Alan West's Steadfast and Loyal podcast, you mentioned the fake YouTube accounts to foment racial strife. Can you elaborate on those efforts?
Yeah, I mean, they do several things. They have this sort of ground campaign. China has these groups in the United States that are aligned with them that are extremely divisive. So, in 2020, during the protests, you had people, raising questions about, can the police better interact with certain communities? Are there things we can do? These groups were pushing all cops are racist. We need to abolish the police. So they always push the very extreme agenda. They're doing that on the streets, but they're also doing that online. And what they essentially do is they have more than 1,000 Chinese military personnel, each of whom controls roughly 1,000 social media accounts in the United States on X or on YouTube. And they are posing not as the Chinese nationals they're posing as people like you and me, like a homemaker in Iowa. And again, the messages are very divisive. Half of these accounts essentially say America's a hopelessly racist, bigoted society. And the other half of the accounts are basically ordinarily looking Americans saying, you know what, I only like white people. And what they're trying to do is turn us against each other. And I would say if there is an optimistic note in my book, which can be pretty pessimistic, I think it shows that a lot of this strife we're facing in the country, not all of it, But a lot of it, I think, is being manufactured or being stoked by China. They're trying to make it appear that we're a much more racially divided society than we actually are. And in 2020, YouTube got rid of a couple of 100,000 accounts that were run by Chinese nationals that were doing this. Facebook got rid of hundreds of thousands of accounts that were doing the same thing. And Marie, the only reason they caught those people is that they were posting all of their comments from 9 to 5 Beijing time. So it was so obvious. Well, they become a lot more sophisticated now. They're still doing it. So, I would just say, don't trust what you're seeing online. People that are saying stupid, ugly things, I would say the odds are pretty high that the person actually behind that account is not the person that they appear to be. It's somebody in China that's trying to get us to turn on each other.
And that's true, because you see, when people start talking to each other about political issues, they really aren't that far apart in some aspects. And so it is absolutely a manufactured phenomena. Now, almost every young American has TikTok on their smartphone and actively participates on the platform. Speaking directly to them, what would you say about this social media platform?
Well, I would say, and I talk about this in the book, look at what the Chinese military and intelligence officials say about TikTok. Don't take my word for it or some congressman in DC. I quote a Chinese military officer as saying TikTok is the ultimate Trojan horse because it gives them access to young people. And the debate we're having in this country about whether they're using it for propaganda, they're not having that debate in China. They already acknowledged that they're using it for propaganda, and it's highly sophisticated propaganda. I run across young people all the time who say, look, if it's some ridiculous thing, I'll know it, I'll see it. You're really missing the point. The propaganda is not going to be some, waving of the Chinese flag in the wind with patriotic music. They describe how they essentially engage in deconstructing people and getting them to move in the direction of the ideas that they want, and it's through emotion. They describe at length how TikTok is the ultimate platform to engage somebody in an emotional level, and when you rile them up emotionally and they share your anger or disgust at what is being seen, these propaganda specialists in China will say this allows them to essentially co-opt you. Because once you embrace that feeling and emotion, you think you've internally generated that feeling, that you're engaging in sort of righteous indignation. I'm angry at what I'm seeing, and this is coming from me. What these propagandists say is, no, it's not. It's coming from us. And once you have adopted the feeling that we want you to adopt, guess what? We can now steer you in the direction to embrace the views and values that we want you to embrace. So recognize that this is what they're saying, what they recognize as the value of this app. And then also realize that ByteDance is not just a Chinese company, it is a unique Chinese company. It's bad enough that it's at the beck and call of the Chinese government because of where it's located. ByteDance is different. It is wedded to the Chinese state. So that algorithm, that all-powerful algorithm that everybody's talking about, it's not just a ByteDance company secret. In 2020, the Chinese government designated it as a state secret. That's how much importance the Chinese government places on it. And also recognize that ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, also does extensive research with the Chinese Ministry of State Security on subjects like how to manipulate people online. So this is not your ordinary Chinese company. And they also are quite vocal amongst themselves in describing how they are using it to manipulate and steer young people in the United States.
Well, and also the concerns about privacy and data, and the concern about spyware.
Yep, absolutely. If you have this on your phone, they have access to everything, including your contacts. And look, there's a reason that China wants this information. They want to monitor you. They want to know what you are interested in. But they also want it for artificial intelligence. The key to the AI race between the United States and China is ultimately going to come down to data, because data is what fuels these AI algorithms. The more data you have, the better. So by using these Chinese apps, you're not only giving up your privacy to where they know what you're doing and what you're interested in, you're also helping them in the AI race because it's helping them fine tune their AI research to use against the United States in one form or another.
Now, you point out, quote, one of the most divisive issues in America today is the debate over trans rights. Here, too, you see the hand of these Beijing linked organizations and financiers. For the PSL, Party of Socialism and Liberation, the trans movement has become a central part of the radical Marxist movement, end quote. How so?
Yeah, it's very interesting. This is probably the most interesting part of the research in the book, and we kind of stumbled on it. But if you look at this trans movement that has arisen over the last, 4 or 5 years in the United States, it turns out that two of the largest funders of this movement in the U.S. are actually Chinese-based billionaires. One is a guy named Joe Tsai. He is the co-founder of Alibaba, which is basically the Amazon of China. He takes a very strong CCP line. The Chinese Communist Party can do no wrong. He's supportive of their foreign policy. He's supportive of their human rights policy. He's a China apologist. He and his wife have poured tens of millions of dollars into the trans movement in the United States. And it's a little bit of a mystery because he's not trans. His wife is not trans. He doesn't have trans children. Why he has picked this issue. But even more interesting, Marie, is that he does not advocate for these issues in China. Again, he adopts the CCP line, and the Chinese Communist Party has been very critical of the trans movement to the point where they even don't want so-called effeminate men on national television in China. So you have to wonder, why is he so passionate about this issue in the United States, but he doesn't bring it up in China? And that brings us to the second billionaire in China that is funding this movement, and that's an American named Roy Singham. He made a lot of money with his tech company, which he sold to a investment fund that's partly owned by China. He essentially became a billionaire. He left the United States, moved to China, which is where he has lived for the last 5 years. He's very close to the CCP. He has poured $160 million into radical causes over the last 4 to 5 years, including the trans movement. And again, you have this really weird dichotomy, which is he's all for this in the United States, and yet when it comes to China, he never criticizes the Chinese government for their hard line on these issues, which leads me to believe that they see this as a very powerful, decisive weapon that they can deploy against the United States. And I think it's been very effective because, again, it's one of those flashpoint issues that is turning American against American in a very divisive debate.
Now, if we could ask you to speculate, Peter, given their history of creating social division in the United States, their alliance with Iran and their refusal to categorize Hamas as a terrorist group, even after October 7th, how involved would you guess China is in all of these pro-Hamas student protests?
Well, I write about this in Blood Money, and there's been more information that's come out since its publication. But if you look at two organizations that are very pro-Beijing, these organizations that have pledged their allegiance to the CCP, there is some money that has flowed from Chinese sources to them directly and or indirectly. These groups are PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Freedom Road Socialist Organization. These two pro-Beijing groups were at the center of a lot of the most violent, angry protests in 2020, and now they have morphed themselves into pro-Hamas groups. These entities are at ground zero at most of these violent confrontations on campus, most of these efforts to shut down traffic. These are very, very destructive groups. In fact, there was a Chinese publication that recently, that's state-owned, that kind of lauded these protests and called out PSL for being at the forefront of a lot of these protests. So there's no question this apparatus, this pro-China apparatus exists in the United States. It has pushed other radical causes like defund the police. They are now being used, these same entities and organizations, to push the pro-Hamas message. And let's be clear, Marie, these protests are not saying we want a ceasefire. They are not saying we do not want to negotiate agreements, as much as I would agree with those solutions, given what Hamas has done. These radicals are saying we want a Hamas victory. That's what they're advocating. And that is actually China's position on the international stage as well. So China's hand, I would argue, is very present in these pro-Hamas protests, and they've been from the beginning.
Incredible. Now, two other figures that you spotlight in Blood Money are the current governor and the likely future governor of California, Gavin Newsom and Adam Schiff. You write that both place their self-interest ahead of the interests of the people they represent in their dealings with China. Could you speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, Gavin Newsom, it's very interesting. I mean, he's very pro-China, very loath to criticize them. And it would be easy to say, well, maybe he's just naive, or maybe it's just, he wants the business investment in California. It actually goes deeper. It goes back several decades, as I lay out in the book. He, beginning when he was the mayor of San Francisco, cultivated and developed relationships with a number of individuals that are not only linked to China, but are linked to Chinese organized crime. And one of the things you have to understand about Chinese organized crime is that these so-called triads basically made their peace with the Chinese Communist Party in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said, as long as you are patriotic, meaning you're pro-CCP, you can go ahead and engage in all the criminal activity in the United States and elsewhere that you want. We're not going to hold it against you. And in fact, when criminals with these Chinese networks are sought out in the United States and they flee back to China, the CCP actually protects them. Well, Gavin Newsom became very friendly with a lot of them when he was mayor of San Francisco, and actually picked them as investment partners to come and invest in businesses in California. And I think that has entangled him in a web of relationships that makes him loath to criticize the Chinese CCP or even pay any attention to what these Chinese criminal networks are doing. I think when you look at Adam Schiff, it's somewhat similar, not quite as well as developed as it was with Gavin Newsom, but he had in his district, when he was a member of Congress, a company called Allied Wallets. The head of that company, Andy Kawaja, is now a fugitive from the FBI, but he poured more than $100,000 into Adam Schiff's 2016 congressional campaign. The two became friends. They had lunch with Saudi princes in Beverly Hills. The problem is that Andy Kawaja, when he was giving that money, was already under FBI investigation for money laundering. And what Kawaja's company, Allied Wallet, which was located in Schiff's district, was doing was laundering money for, among other people, Chinese organized crime figures involved in the international drug trade. So Adam Schiff does not want to talk about China's role in fentanyl. He does not want to talk about China's aggressive posture towards the United States. Again, I think this would be deeply embarrassing to Adam Schiff to have this conversation. So he would rather that these Chinese issues just go away.
A last question for you, Peter. Another of the many interesting characters you mentioned in Blood Money is Guo Wengui, who recently had his penthouse set on fire just hours after he was charged with defrauding investigators in a massive online scam. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, this is a guy that emerged in 2017 from China, said he was a fugitive from the CCP. The CCP said that he stole a lot of money. And what this Chinese billionaire essentially did was look for allies in the conservative movement. And he found some that he provided funding for. These individuals continue to take an anti-CCP line, which is the posture that Guo took. But concerns started to emerge that Guo maybe wasn't so estranged from the CCP as he claimed. He had people from the Ministry of State Security that visited his penthouse in New York. Some of the media entities that he set up, when you looked at the back end of those operations, were included passwords and email accounts that were available in mainland China, indicated that maybe he wasn't so disconnected from mainland China. And the concern here is that Guo was a replay of what the Soviets did in the 1920s, which was called Operation Trust. In other words, what they did in the 1920s was they said, there's this anti-Soviet movement in Europe. How are we going to try to undermine it? Why don't we set up our own Soviet movements, become partners with them, and we can undermine them accordingly. And I think that is what GWO was up against. So this involved people like Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon continued to take a very anti-CCP position. But the concern is that GWO was maybe trying to use him to gain access to find out who some of the anti-CCP activists were and to gain leverage over them for the benefit of his potential allies in Beijing. He's in court right now facing these fraud charges. It's going to be interesting in these court hearings to see how this story further emerges. But I'm skeptical that he is an anti-CCP activist. I think that his relationships with Beijing are too well developed. And I do think that this was an effort to try to undermine the anti-CCP activists in the West.
If you're just joining us, our guest this segment has been Peter Schweizer. He is the author of the best-selling book, Blood Money, Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. Peter, how can our audience continue to follow you online and follow your work?
Well, Maria, it's always a pleasure to be on with you. You can follow me on Twitter at Peter Schweizer. You can go to peterschweizer.com. I also have a podcast called The Drilldown, which you can find at thedrilldown.com, or you can find wherever podcasts are located. And there are opportunities in some of these areas to communicate with me. So if you have something you think we should investigate, or you have a question about something, we will certainly try to answer it if you send us a query.
Thank you so much. It's always great to have you on, Peter.
Thanks for having me, Marie. Great to see you.